Nice Speech Lady. Useful resources for medical SLPs. Created by one who is just like you out in the field. Creative, practical, evidence-based resources. Building up, learning from one another.
Hello and welcome back to the Nice Speech Lady Show. I'm glad you joined us. Pull up a seat and join us today. Thanks for coming along. We've got a great show lined up today. We have Teresa Giralimo and Samantha Galli, who both are here to talk about multi-linguistic cultural diversity and testing and treatment and diagnosis, and how we can all improve in this area as practitioners in learning how we can become more effective at serving our clients and improving quality of care. So please stay tuned to the interview that's coming up. I'm really excited about it, and I'm so thankful that they took the time to join us on the show today. Before we jump over to that, let's come on over to Nice Speech Lady. I'd like to show you a recent resource that I published, and this is for patients who are in facilities. So they're in skilled nursing facilities, they're in assisted livings, they're in some sort of facility where they're full-time, or maybe they go to recreational centers and they participate in activities, or they may be eligible to participate in activities. I found that a lot of patients tend to isolate, and I thought it was important to research and look into the benefits of activities and have a resource available for clinicians to be able to hand to patients and say, look, here are all the benefits of participating in activities. Here's how you advocate for what you need. Here are some ways to ask for what you need. And so that's the purpose of this resource. So this introductory page talks about all the components of the resource. And the first page here talks about the reasons for participating, the positives of participating in structured activities in a facility. Everything from being in touch with staff members to developing those relationships, practicing tasks that are being pinpointed in therapy, to taking your mind off pain or discomfort or distracting you from any emotions you might be feeling, having fun, increasing joy, making friends, facilitating new routines, giving yourself the chance to focus on a leisure task, a chance to let it all go, experiencing new experiences, having new feelings, becoming encouraged and hearing stories about how other patients or residents are improving in their recovery journey, contributing to joint projects, something outside of yourself, and making those new connections, and receiving opportunities for extra snacks, and chances to make new connections. There's a section here at the bottom of these reasons for participating where a patient could be asked, what are your needs? What do you have that are needs at this time that are being unmet? And, you know, let's just think about what you would like, what you need that's not being met at this time. And then there's, you know, once these things are identified, then the clinician and patient can problem solve how to address this unmet need, and possibly through activities that might be able to be addressed. And if not, how can the clinician assist the patient in fulfilling this need, or advocating to assist the patient in pursuing meeting of this need. So that it just allows a section for the patient to reflect for a second on an unmet need. And there's opportunity for a lot of unmet needs to be met through these structured activities. And then there's a section for tips to mold your activities. Patients need to understand that they can advocate for activities that are meaningful for them. That's what the research shows, is that if it's something that the patient finds that's important to the patient, something that's functional for the patient, something that the patient identifies as important and meaningful to them, that's the activity that's going to benefit the patient the most. So the patients need to advocate for that. So the standard activities that the same activities that are done every 2 weeks may not be a good fit for the patient. So having those conversations or encouraging the patient to have those conversations with the therapy director, the activities director, the activities staff, to have them ask for other opportunities of activities that interest them, and then also other suggestions on how to incorporate therapy tasks into the activities, safely, of course, and with assistance. But there are just a lot of suggestions here. And then there's information about physical activity for older adults and what the recommended suggested amounts of physical activity are for a typical older adult, and then adding physical components into the day to improve quality of life. And it's just, for your information purposes, and how to incorporate that into activities as much as possible. And then, of course, there's a section here for the references, the articles and research that was used in creating the resource. So please check out that on Nice Speech Lady, and please utilize that with your patients. I found it helpful with some patients to start those conversations and encourage patients to avoid isolating. So that's something that's been a benefit to me. I want to take a moment and think about a situation. I was thinking the other day, if I were visiting my brother in Japan, which I've done in the past, and let's say I had a medical event happen while I was in Japan. Now, I know some Japanese words, and I'm not fluent in Japanese. I only know some functional phrases. If I were, for example, to have a stroke while I was in Japan and was unable to travel back to the United States for treatment, and I was in Japan and the stroke affected my communication skills and I needed to be evaluated by a speech pathologist or related professional in Japan, I would definitely want to be tested in my native language. It wouldn't be fair to me to be tested in Japanese because I don't have full knowledge of that language. And so it's important to keep these things in mind and put myself in the shoes of the patient as I encounter patients who are multilingual or where English is not their first language. And we have to think about what's going to be appropriate for a patient and how we can best serve our patients and their needs as we navigate working with patients from diverse cultures and different communities, different from our own. It's important for us to open our mind and see how we can expand our ways of thinking so that we can serve patients in the best possible way and as effectively as possible as clinicians, as we would want someone to do for us in the same type of situation. So we're going to be transitioning now to the interview portion of the show. Please stay tuned for that.
Hi, this is Walt Fritz from Foundations and Manual Therapy Seminars. I'd like to take a few moments here just to invite you to check out my website or even check out the seminars that I teach. But even if you don't take a seminar, much like Wilson's website, my website's sort of a big resource for a lot of different information for speech pathologists as well as other therapists interested in both manual therapy as well as the rather unique and to some people strange approach that I have to a patient-centered model of care. On the website, you're going to find a ton of information and resources, including a lot of evidence and research to support both the work that I teach, the manual therapy hands-on work, as well as this shared decision-making model. You're going to find a number of different videos that we've done. We've got a split screen done with internal view through a FEES of what's happening inside when we apply some of the external forces outside. Not that it proves anything, but it does show that there's a fact that's translated inside, potentially allowing the patient to create some changes from here to here. You're also going to find a lot of other podcasts with some industry leaders that I've made, articles, videos, lots of resources. You know, when people come to my class, they think they're coming to something to really sharpen or teach them manual therapy hands-on skills, which is certainly something that I do cover. But the thing that they leave with is how to leverage manual therapy or any other intervention they use into a model that allows the patient more input in sharing the decisions instead of us making all the decisions. So if you're interested, you can take a look at the website, waldfritz.com, and drop me a message there, and hope to see you down the road someday.
Teresa Giralimo, PhD, is a postdoctoral fellow in the Cognitive Neuroscience of Communication Department at the University of Connecticut. Her research involves language acquisition in Black, Indigenous, and people of color, otherwise known as BIPOC, autistic young adults with language impairment, and more broadly, advancing equity in society and science. We also have Samantha Galli, CCCSLP. She's a speech language pathologist, interpreter, and doctoral candidate at the University of Kansas. Samantha's international clinical experience includes populations across the lifespan, from home-based early intervention to adult medical inpatient and outpatient settings. Samantha's clinical research interests include the interpretation and adaptation of speech and language assessments. So thank you so much for both being here for the interview. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you for this opportunity.
I know it took us a little bit of time back and forth to find a time that we were all available. I know we're all very, very busy. And I know that you all are knee deep in a lot of different projects. You're doing your studies, you're doing your projects. Let's go ahead and just jump right in. I'll start with you, Teresa. We're talking, of course, about diversity. We're talking about testing. We're talking about multilingualism, a lot of things that we all need to learn more about and always need to be improving on. Let's just start talking about just key areas we as speech pathologists need to keep in mind when we're providing quality of care across diverse populations in terms of practice and research.
Sure, that's such a great question. I want to highlight two things in my answer here. The first thing, when I think about quality of care, is how different it can look across communities. For example, especially when we think about providing services or assessing culturally and linguistically diverse individuals who come from different backgrounds, walks of life, and communities. Well, different folks may see different types of communication needs in their own way. And I think as a practitioner or as a CSD professional, in my case, I'm a researcher, it's important to keep that in the back of your head when you approach really working with an individual, because oftentimes it also means working with their family and understanding what their cultural norms are. And it can really make a world of difference in developing trust and rapport, and therefore having a better chance of getting what we think is a valid language assessment performance. The second piece I would like to highlight is that even though we are all qualified professionals, learning about cultural and linguistic diversity and what that means for the profession is a lifelong process. It never really stops. I know for those folks who hold certification, maybe you get that through continuing education credits, or if you're licensed, you get continuing education credits. But above and beyond that, it's really just a lifelong process.
Right. So talking about, quality of care.
Yes.
So in terms of practice and research, other than those things you talked about, I'm sure that there are a lot of common questions that clinicians have when they're assessing patients, when they're treating patients. So Samantha, what are the common questions that people, that speech pathologists come up with? What do you hear most often, and what are the solutions? What are the answers to those questions?
Yeah, to a large extent, a lot of those big picture questions about assessment, diagnosis, treatment remain quite the same as for monolingual populations. So in case a medical history isn't available, are there opportunities to review that case history somewhere else before meeting with the patient? If in the case that it is available, do we have the time to see, that case history before we see the patient? What observations are we taking note of when we do see the patient, when we do meet with those families from caregivers? Other considerations are things like what assessments are appropriate for that patient given the presentations of their signs and symptoms. And once we do administer those assessments, how are we going to use those results to make a diagnosis determination? Considerations to keep in mind when we're working with adult multilingual populations include such things like, how do we establish rapport with patients beyond obtaining a medical history or beyond that run-of-the-mill, hello, how do you do? Because when we do that, we can find information from families and caregivers that we normally would not have taken into account, and just that regular checklist style medical history that we sometimes are trained to take due to time considerations. Go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt you, but what would some examples of that be? Can you expand on that?
Right. So one example that is something that my research is focused on is the fact that many languages have different sub-variants or sub-dialects. So for example, if you're asking for, let's say I work with French and Arabic populations, it may be useful to ask the family, would you prefer an interpreter who speaks a certain dialect of Arabic, or would you prefer, a different language, for example? So in the case of Arabic, there are many different Arabics. Spoken Arabic is not the same as written Arabic or the Arabic that's used for formal interactions. So a family might prefer to say, actually, we would like to have, an interpreter who's proficient in the standard dialect, or actually we would prefer to have an interpreter who's proficient in the dialect that we speak at home. And those are things that can be easily found out simply by just, going beyond that medical checklist form that we have.
Okay, I'm sorry I interrupted you. I just had
Not at all.
I had to learn.
Not at all.
What are some other questions that are common things that are brought up?
So when we look at those assessments that we've chosen, we have to think about, given our populations, given the languages that our patients and our families speak, we really need to just take a second out of our time, flip to the populations page in those manuals and say, hey, is my patient or family represented in this assessment? And if they're not, and that's the only thing that we have available to us, how can we incorporate other different types of assessments to give us the information that we need? How do we best interpret those results so that we have valid diagnoses and so that can put us on the path to a good therapy plan? So those are the main questions that come up for me. Go ahead, Teresa.
And I want to hop in here. So building off of that, I know oftentimes clinicians have to function in whatever their given workplace is. And maybe each workplace has set rules of what they should be doing an assessment in order to qualify them for services or to complete, a diagnostic evaluation. So if the case comes up and you do have to include you do have to use certain assessments, even though the folks you're working with may not necessarily be represented in that test norming sample. Well, one workable solution would be to state what the assessment result was and then cite the manual. And you can flat out state that, looking at the test normative sample, it is evident or unclear at best whether someone like this client was represented in the test norming. And therefore, I would be hesitant as a trained professional to feel comfortable making assumptions about validity of this assessment performance. And that's easy.
Right. So, and this question is for you, Teresa. I prepared this question for you, but please jump in, Samantha, after Teresa has her turn. So, in this subject, what are we doing effectively and what do we really need to work on?
So first and foremost, I want to state that I am not a clinical practitioner. I'm really a researcher working the area of language assessment. And for what it's worth, I'm a former classroom teacher of autistic young adults. What I see as someone who is now in the field of CSD is I feel like as a profession, one thing we were doing well is that people are interested in learning about cultural and linguistic diversity. I think one challenging point is that everyone is at a different path in their, or a different point in their journey in terms of understanding what that means and what it does not mean. And especially now, I feel like due to whatever dynamics are going on, the topic of diversity can be extremely politically charged, so that it's very easy for people to perhaps be interested on some level, but if they hear a certain term that to their minds carries like stark political connotations, that they shut down. And so one area I would like to see us really move forward is kind of putting down those barriers, or finding ways to put down those defensive barriers and really become vulnerable enough to engage in dialogue with one another. Because I think that is what will help our profession and ultimately allow us to provide the most efficacious and responsive services to all the individuals in society that we are tasked with serving by nature of our profession.
And can I ask how can we do that? What are some ideas you have for us to do that?
Well, I think it's by offering people a range of opportunities to engage. So for example, I know some folks may feel terrified of saying the wrong thing, although they're interested in learning. And I know it isn't everybody's everybody's responsibility to necessarily educate others all the time. But forums like this, right, where you have a podcast, is an easy and accessible way for people to tune in, listen to a bit, or listen to an entire episode if that, suits what they're interested in. That's one great venue. I know there have been other opportunities like listening sessions from different universities and our professional organization, ASHA. And I know that there's a number of other resources out there to allow people to kind of learn more in a low stakes format. And then perhaps over time, maybe they start going to state conventions or to other types of professional conferences, and maybe there's a topic on diversity and they feel comfortable attending that. I think it's going to have to be built around offering multiple opportunities and also pathways for developing personal connections, because it's harder to be polarized when you're sitting down face to face or, on Zoom with different people that you see at an individual level than it is to, like hop onto Twitter or some social media site. And it's very easy for everyone to kind of devolve into the worst version of themselves.
Right. So has, in hearing you say that, it sounds like for people like me, it really comes down to starting the building block of just having awareness that there's a need to grow in this area.
Awareness, and I would say also like a commitment to think about one thing you want to change. And it doesn't have to be large, because I found that when people go all or nothing, they end up burnt out. But maybe you could say, I've never thought about this before. Like in Samantha's example, when she talked about the test assessment manual, maybe your change is you commit to looking up, one test norming sample for one assessment and seeing who is and is not represented in that test norming sample. And that can be, your change. And then you decide what is feasible for you to do next.
Absolutely. What about you, Samantha? I'm sure you have some thoughts on what we're doing effectively and what we could improve on.
I love the example that Teresa, that you brought up with regard to making those connections and being intentional about engaging with other speakers. Because one thing that I've been thinking about is how SLPs or all providers could be using the services of interpreters more effectively. So that's one way where we can reach across the aisle or reach across the professions and really make those connections. And I'll tell a little bit of a story that Something that one of my colleagues did for me that was very moving, and for the family too, because what she did was she made a connection with me even though we weren't in person. But one way that I'm thinking about has to do with the availability of interpretation services. So I know that that does vary from setting to setting. I've been in outpatient settings where medical interpreters were readily available in person, and then in inpatient settings where all that's available is what's called video remote interpreting, or VRI options, that were used to supplement any salaried or in-person interpreters in case they were all booked up for the day and couldn't see a patient or family. The one that the hospital that I worked at was called the MARTI system. So with that, go ahead.
Oh, I didn't have a
Oh,
question.
I thought someone said something, sorry. Yeah, so what that availability can look like in terms of interpreters may be able to shape the opportunities that we have as clinicians, but it doesn't have to be that way. So in settings where we do have the good fortune to work side by side with medical interpreters regularly, whether that's in person or via telehealth, it comes down to two main things. So number one, valuing other providers, in this case interpreters, as valuable knowledge brokers in the therapy setting. And secondly is recognizing the value that rapport has, and that ongoing rapport with an interpreter, the family, and what that can bring to the assessment, diagnosis, and treatment process. So one example, like I was mentioning earlier, where one of my colleagues had utilized my services above and beyond the therapy session, is she had noticed that when she was asking questions, the family kept asking her for clarification. So they didn't quite understand the way in which she was asking those questions. Mm-hmm. And she took the time to reflect, and she also paid attention to my sometimes subtle and not so subtle hints to maybe provide a little more context when she was asking those questions to the family, because without that background information culturally as to why she was asking certain questions in a certain way, the family was feeling, and the patient was feeling, a little thrown off, like, why are you asking this question? So she took the time to ask if I would chat with her over Zoom for 15 to 20 minutes. She bought me Zoom coffee. And in that conversation, she did something I really didn't expect. She thanked me for the valuable service that I was providing for the family. And she said that she realized that there was so much time in therapy being taken up because the family needed that clarification. She wasn't giving or asking them the questions in the way in which they would understand them right away. And she also mentioned something interesting to me that I didn't expect. She said she had noticed pragmatic features about the conversation. So she'd noticed their facial expressions, their body language in response to the questions that she was asking. And then she said, let me know how I can do better. What are some ways that I can frame questions that would make them, either more, that the family, we wouldn't have to spend so much time in therapy having to explain the questions over and over again. And I said, it really has to do with that context. Really just taking an extra second to say, the reason why I'm asking this is, or this is how this question is connected to what I'm going to ask you to do next for therapy. Mm-hmm. And it was like a light bulb went off for her. Mm-hmm. So she said, that's such an easy fix. I can absolutely do that. And she did something else that I found really interesting. She said, when you find that I'm asking a question that doesn't have enough context, could you please just give me a nudge and remind me, or just let me know, like say, hey, what do you mean by this? Or could you explain this a little bit more? And that's not something that I expected at all in my capacity as an interpreter. So typically as an interpreter, you're asked to be a very neutral presence, and there are ethical reasons for that, of course. But the fact that she noticed that her questions were making the family uncomfortable, and she took this step to say, how can I do better for myself? How can I do better for this family and for the patient? And all it took was 15 minutes for the benefit of the patient and their family. And by doing so, she said, you've helped me expand my skill set as an SLP, because paying attention to communication is something I have to do all the time. It's not necessarily unique to this one situation of this multilingual patient and family. And I'll never forget what she did for that family, and for me too.
Well, that really speaks to the benefit of collaboration and really appreciating what each professional brings to the table and how we can help each other. What are some other things that that clinicians need to know, just basic things about interpreting, like allowing extra time, for the session? And what are some basic things that someone who's never used an interpreter needs to know to be effective to utilize the services?
So I would say if they can get the hands on that book that I had mentioned by Henriette Langdon, she has a wonderful set of recommendations. The book is highly readable. There's not technical jargon in there. And, it's like, almost like bedtime reading. Like I could read that and just keep going with it because it's so accessible. It's a great read. And I think that starting with a resource like that, or even just starting with some of the ASHA SIGs, SIG 17, SIG 14, checking in with your colleagues, checking in with the interpreters who are colleagues at work, asking them directly, what are some things that would be helpful for you? So for some individuals, yes, allowing more time is a great thing to do. It can also make some people feel a little awkward. So it's great to ask, how can I make this session, as accessible as possible to the family? What would be helpful for you on a one-to-one basis? So I think, it doesn't have to be, we don't have to go and, do a whole research project on how to work with, different families, but doing, changing up our techniques on a case-by-case basis.
I think the subject of accessibility to interpreters is really important in working with adults on the medical side, because it's something that I run into a lot. And I was actually contacted this week by a former student who ran into a situation and she needed some guidance. And the ethics of if an interpreter is not available, all those things have to be navigated. What are some resources that, other than what you've already mentioned, what's available? Even both of you can speak to this. What are your number one picks for people to start out with, other than what you've already mentioned?
So this, I don't have a specific book, but frankly, I found that poking around ASHA's website and the community sites was the most helpful for me as someone relatively young in the field of CSD. I know that I've made very good use of the Office of Multicultural Affairs because on their page, they link to many other resources out there for all things related to cultural and linguistic diversity. I also take note of ASHA's publications. For example, I know they have a new set of guidelines out on how to work with clients who are LGBTQIA+. And that's been really helpful for someone like myself in just understanding where folks from that community see themselves as having their needs met or unmet, and how how CSD professionals can better support their needs. So that would be one source I would make use of. And then I know that with ASHA communities, some of them are paid because they're tied to the special interest groups, and maybe that cost isn't accessible to everyone. But I do know that if you track some of them, for example, SIG 17, so the one for international affairs, if I have that right, the name might be different, but it's for international affairs. They actually posted something saying that they had X number of memberships to give away. So it could be the case that if you're really interested in a SIG, that cost is not accessible to you. I would say don't hesitate to reach out to them and let them know you're interested, but you just can't afford the cost right now. And they may have some extra memberships laying around that they could provide to you.
Okay. Anything to add on that, Samantha?
So was that question going back to, when interpreters aren't available, or other solutions?
Right. What resources do SLPs have available? What's the most beneficial resources to have in mind?
I think in addition to what Teresa was mentioning with regard to those online resources, again, taking advantage of the resources that are in-house, I would take a look at what the facility or what the clinic has done in the past. What have their practices been? Checking in with other colleagues to say, hey, what have you found useful? Checking in with other interpreters on staff or other services that are provided. Looking into the interpretation service that's being offered. Doing a bit of background research on that company would be wonderful and very informative.
Let me jump to the next question. Teresa, in getting ready for this interview, I was thinking about just advocating for the needs of patients that speak a language, that they're monolinguistic or they're multilinguistic, how can we best advocate for their needs, just in general? What have you found along the way that helps the best?
Frankly, this is coming from my time as an educator, but I found what is the most useful is to listen to what they are telling you and let that guide how you're going to advocate for their needs. And this is why, because I have the perspective that all individuals, regardless of their communication needs, have a voice, meaning they already have an opinion of how they see themselves, of how they see their needs, and of how they see their goals as being relevant to service delivery or to language assessment. And if you can take that and really take this role of facilitator, meaning that, of course, yes, we are all trained CSD professionals, but if we use our skills to listen to their voices and put that together with assessment practices, whether for diagnosis or research purposes or for developing a treatment plan, that is going to be the most effective, rather than if we disregard what their own goals are and what their own opinions are about their lives and simply go ahead with what the assessment, kind of totally independent of the individuals that we're working with. It's better to integrate both of those things rather than just using assessment alone.
Right. I see you nodding, Samantha. You agree with that?
I would say absolutely. And when I think back to our skill sets as SLPs and clinicians, we have stellar credentials, right? We're diagnosticians, we're therapists, we provide counseling within the scope of the profession. We work with individuals, we work with groups of individuals, we work with families, we work within teams, we work across teams, and a large part of what makes our work so rewarding is that we get to support others to break down those barriers in communication or other areas of their healthcare. And communication is a human right. So to ensure that access to communication remains that way, we can use that stellar skill set to advocate for pathways, for our patients and our clients that may not be there before.
Absolutely. Let me ask you, Samantha, about, let me jump back to interpreting. I was just curious about in this time of telepractice, blowing up, and being more and more accessible and having more and more options that clinicians have access to and patients have availability. How should we frame use of interpreting differently if we're using the service delivery model of telepractice?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because in the story I was mentioning earlier, I was an interpreter joining that therapy session virtually, so remotely. I'd never met the SLP in person. I'd never met the family in person. So I think so many of the same principles, again, from in-person team building, apply to making the most of assessment, intervention, and even discharge. So that clear and prompt communication, mutual respect for the patient and their families and other providers, and keeping in mind that as SLPs or as audiologists, we may be one of the many providers that family or patient has seen that day. But what I found to make telepractice particularly successful for the patient and their families as a whole is those intentional check-ins from all the providers with one another. So that's before, during, or after the assessment or therapy session, not just at the point of service. So much like what that colleague did for me, all it took for her was to take 15 minutes out of her day to say, hey, I enjoy working with you, and I'd love to learn more from you so that I can serve this patient and their families better. And that made a world of a difference to the patient and their family, the way that she and I worked together. And she was able to get more done in that therapy session and hit more goals because she was able to communicate more clearly with the family, and less time was going that back and forth of, what do you mean by this question? So everybody won all around.
And it sounded like you all really served the patient much more effectively once those things were communicated clearly between one another. Let me ask you, Teresa, the last question I had on my list, and we're about wrapping up this interview. I asked you about advocating for patients. What about just advocating for the tools that we need as clinicians? How can we best advocate for the populations we're talking about, a diverse community, diverse communities, but for all patients, how can we more effectively advocate?
Well, as CSD professionals, we are in a very unique position. So following like an advocacy model from people who I think used it originally to study something like city building and energy. But hear me out here. They have something called a middle out advocacy approach. And it means thinking of the different types of stakeholders who hold different types of advocacy positions. So in the field of CSD, we could think of clients or examinees, in the case that we're working with folks in research, as being at the bottom, and they can exert influence upward, meaning that they can let you know how they feel about assessment, and you here being CSD professionals. But unless our clients or examinees take on the role of self-advocate, meaning that they are an individual with a communication need and they choose to really use their voice in a different way, they're probably not going to be in the middle, which is where I kind of see CSD professionals being. So in the middle, CSD professionals can exert influence in 3 different ways. First and foremost, as we have already discussed, we can use our voice and exert influence downward towards examinees, meaning that as diagnosticians and as practitioners or as researchers, we have the power to make assumptions about the validity of treatment or assessment or diagnosis. And we can also exert influence sideways, right, with other stakeholders in the field of CSD. So among ourselves, we can certainly speak about our needs through forums, and people can choose whatever forum they feel is the most accessible to them. And then we can also think about exerting influence upward to places like our professional association, ASHA. We can also think about whatever other professional associations we may belong to and advocating for our needs in that sense. Or we could think about exerting our influence and speaking up to other places like test developers, right? And letting them know what our needs are and how our needs can better be addressed. And then of course at the top are kind of these large associations and test developers who can exert their influence downward, right, towards like CSD professionals with an ultimate impact on the people that we're working with in practice and research. So I think we have unique pathways for making sure that our voice is heard. And while I would never expect any one CSD professional to take on an insurmountable burden, maybe a better choice is to let each professional decide what is going to be feasible for their lives and thinking about whether or not they want to do things like serve on boards and committees, perhaps in ASHA, and exert their influence in that way, or whether they want to do things like host a podcast, right, to get the word out on topics that they're thinking about. I really think there is something for everyone. And as with kind of being on a journey for everything DEI, I would say don't go crazy. Pick like one thing and start small to make sure that it's sustainable.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that, Samantha?
Yeah, and I think that the golden rule stands no matter the field, no matter the subspecialty. So really, engaging with others as we would wish for others to engage with us is always a good rule to stand by. And like Teresa was mentioning, is not a burdensome and insurmountable amount of a change for us to make.
Absolutely. I had one more question, and this one was prepared for you, Samantha, but Teresa, please chime in once Samantha's done. I was just wondering, just in general, what do you most desire speech pathologists to understand the most about evaluating, treating, diagnosing multilingual patients?
Yeah, and I think going back to our stellar credentials as SLPs, we have the skills to differentiate our identification, assessment, diagnosis, and treatment for all of our patients. And again, so much of what makes our work rewarding is that we do get to be part of someone's communication journey, and that we continually have the honor to work with individuals from all walks of life. So we have many opportunities to think outside the box. Our work is a dynamic interplay that puts our patients first. So every patient that we work with is unique. And it's key for us to reflect on some things like, what knowledge and tools do I have at my disposal to be the best, to have the foundation to be the best therapist that my parents need, that my patients need for me to be. And there's just a plethora of resources where we can find that information. But I think, like Teresa was mentioning, even picking one is a perfect place to start.
And I'll hop in with one thing here. Especially as someone who is a former teacher, I would say, don't be afraid to break walls down. I know oftentimes in workplaces, we can feel isolated from other practitioners that all come together to serve individuals with communication needs, especially including those who are multilingual. And I know oftentimes our workplaces are not set up to allow us to actually come together, except for maybe select meetings or specific appointments are kind of made for us. But if you can find other informal ways to reach out, that is incredibly helpful. I used to do this all the time, where in the hallway during maybe when people were coming into the building or out of the building, I would take that time to go and seek out all the other practitioners, meaning the OT, the PT, the counselors, the speech language pathologists, and I would go introduce myself and chat with them on the fly, just kind of about what they were working on, maybe not with a specific individual, but just about more broadly what they saw as being relevant to meeting multilingual individuals' needs. And I've certainly had the same experience in working not with medical interpreters, but with ASL interpreters. So again, I know, for example, if I'm going to be talking to someone who requires an ASL interpreter, I try to be upfront about what I'm going to talk about, so that if I do have to use specific terminology or jargon that might not be basic knowledge that everybody has, I can quickly kind of explain it and define it so that they're as prepared as possible going into that meeting.
Absolutely. So we're wrapping up the interview. I want to give each of you a final thought moment. Any questions I didn't ask that you'd like to speak on? Anything you'd like to add as we wrap up the interview?
Yes. So when you asked us about resources, one I forgot to mention is the community of multicultural constituency groups, which are independent of but affiliated with ASHA. And I know there's a number of them. I am a member of the Asian Pacific Islander Speech Language Hearing Caucus. And I know that if people have questions about working with multilingual clients from Asian and Pacific Islander backgrounds, they will oftentimes email us and ask, I'm working with a client from this background and I don't know what to do. Can you help me? And so then they'll relay it on to the caucus and say, can anyone help this individual? And that is a totally free resource. I think some of the caucuses may have nominal membership fees, but I think most of them are open to getting that type of query if somebody is serving a client and wants more support.
Absolutely. And I'll see if I can find a link to that and then include that in the information. And Samantha, any final thoughts?
I wanted to take the time also to thank you for hosting us, because you did something very much like what we've been advocating this whole time. So you reached out to us, you found something, you read one of our papers, you said, hey, how can I help? So you took an opportunity to, informally reach out to us and say, I would love to host you, how can I help? And I want to commend you, and I want to say thank you for inviting us into this conversation and for providing us this opportunity, because you are a perfect model for how this interaction is supposed to look like. So thank you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure, and I am learning, and I want to continue to learn, and I really appreciate all of your information, and you've given me a lot of things to think about today, and I know that there's a lot more that all of us can learn, and thank you so much for taking the time, and I know your time is very valuable, so thank you so much, and maybe we can have another conversation in the future. Let's keep connecting with one another, and thanks again for your time. Thanks so much for that interview, Samantha and Teresa. I really enjoyed connecting with you both and learning a lot. And I know there'll be more for me to learn in the future, and we can all learn together. And as we're learning about lots of things as speech pathologists, there's a lot of areas that we can all delve into in our journeys of improving our skill set. As professionals, we're always growing, we're always learning. And things change in our profession, and we need to grow and we need to adjust as we learn more and more about how we can more effectively serve our patients. So thanks for that interview, really appreciate it. Please check out the resources that they referenced. I have the links at the bottom of this video, so please check out those resources. And we really want you to think about some of the things that were discussed in the interview today, and what small step can you take today to improve your skill set. And then after that, you'll take your next step, just like I am. So please take a moment to visit the Nice Speech Lady Facebook page, and please join the SLP Support and Nice Speech Lady Facebook group. Please jump over also to Nice Speech Lady and subscribe to the website. There's a pop-up there. There's actually a unique resource that you can only obtain. That's a Nice Speech Lady original resource. You can only obtain it if you subscribe, and that resource is a tips on how to group cognitive linguistic patients, and evidence-based resource that gives information on how to most effectively do that. And so please subscribe to the website. And so just wanted to thank you for joining us today for the show. Always happy to have you. Please subscribe to this channel so that you can be notified when new shows are published. And thanks again for your time. I'm proud of you for what you do every day. You're making a difference in the world. You're making a difference in the lives of the patients, one patient at a time, one family at a time, one individual at a time. You're making a difference. Thanks again for what you do. And thanks again, and have a great month and a great week. Bye-bye. Thanks again.